Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining from today. Thank you for joining our weekly live stream. Today's topic that we're going to be covering is lessons from ERP failures and lawsuits. So we're going to talk about some of the lessons from some of the world's leading failures in the ERP and digital transformation space. I'm going to introduce our guest here in just a moment. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting, and we're an independent consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world with their digital transformation journeys. So thank you for being here today. This is our weekly live podcast interview that we do every Tuesday at the same time and same place. We're streaming to YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. So thank you for being here today. Before I introduce our guest here real quickly, if you don't mind just dropping in the chat where you're joining from today. I'd love to hear what city and country you're joining from here today. We typically get a global audience, so it's always fun to hear where everyone is joining from. So if you don't mind, just drop in the chat what city and country you're from, and you can use that same chat, by the way, to ask questions along the way as we're going through the conversation here today. So today's topic: lessons from ERP failures and lawsuits, and we're gonna get into some of the root causes of why transformations fail, based on our experience having helped clients through expert witness work. Which, if you don't know, expert witness work is essentially advising a court and lawyers on expertise that we have. So when there's a lawsuit related to ERP implementations, my guest and I and others on our team are typically hired to become the experts that will testify in court, do the analysis of why the project's failed. We also have experience with project recoveries too. So I'm sure we'll pull from some of that background as well as we go through the conversation. So joining me today is Scott Janke, PhD from the Third Stage Consulting team, Director of Strategy and Transformation here at Third Stage. Scott, thanks for being here today.
Yeah, I appreciate the invite.
Yeah, this will be a fun conversation. And before I dive into some of the tricky questions I have for you today, what can you tell me about your background, about you and your background?
Yeah, funny enough, I never thought I'd work in technology. I was a business major as an undergrad, but was fortunate enough to join the computer science or computer center at the White House. My first job out of college, so I worked there for about 3 years. And then spent really the next 25 years in consulting and operational roles. I got my teeth in consulting with Deloitte and KPMG, obviously a lot of global projects on those kind of engagements through those firms. And subsequently, as you mentioned, PhD, I've earned my doctorate in IT management, focusing on the acceptance of technology. And I'll talk about how that influences, I think, some of our work that we do with our clients in and outside of expert witness. And also leveraged that, ran a STEM management science master's program at UT Dallas for a few years, and before joining Third Stage.
Great. So you've got quite the experience that runs the gamut of consulting, academia, and stuff in between. So that trifecta, yes. So good stuff. Well, I guess just for the audience's sake, just to help understand what exactly an expert witness is and what it does, can you just explain the whole concept of what an expert witness is to start?
Yeah, I will. Obviously, anyone can Google what the definition is, but from our perspective, when we're hired as an expert witness in a litigation, regardless of the party that we represent, really coming to the table and leveraging all our experience, both theoretical and practical, from an impartial standpoint. And I say that specifically because regardless of who we're representing in the litigation case, we come into it looking as a neutral party and following the breadcrumbs from the beginning of the project to where it actually became a legal case. So we actually look at this from a neutral, impartial, as I mentioned, perspective of understanding truly what is happening across, whether it's the software vendor, the system integrator, even the client, where things kind of started falling apart, and providing, again, our expertise in working with clients today from a live perspective. We do actually do quite a few assessment cases as well. Clients will hire us midstream when they start getting a sense that a project is off the rails, and we follow very much the same effort. Those tend to be 2 to 3 months. Litigations can be years, so the duration is really different, but ultimately we kind of still look at the trail of the breadcrumbs from the beginning to the end, and really understanding from our perspective, collective perspectives, being a client as well as consulting firm, where things again started going off the track.
Right. So in these cases, you typically have a plaintiff, of course, that is typically, and not always, but typically it's the company that was implementing technology, that the end customer is typically the plaintiff, and they're suing typically either the software vendor and or the party that implemented the software,
Right.
and that's the defendant in most cases. Sometimes the software vendor will end up suing or countersuing the plaintiff. But when we're looking at these cases where company fails in their implementation, they sue software vendor and or system integrator or implementer, who's well, first of all, who do we typically represent? Our team, or which side
Most
are we
often
on?
it's the client, the entity that actually secured the software, secured the SI, and is one paying the bill for the implementation is typically the one that feels the brunt of a project that has failed either at the beginning or at the end.
Right, right. And of course, there are times where software vendor or system integrator hires us as well to
Sure.
be on the defense.
Sure.
But it does seem like over the years, I don't know why this is, but it seems like it's sort of trended the direction you're talking, which is more the end customer that ends
Right.
up being that more commonly hires us. But when we're looking at these cases, then you've got the side that we're on, which is typically the plaintiff, but not always. And then you've got the defense, typically the software vendor, not always. Whose fault is it typically when we're doing these cases?
It's interesting when we start having conversation with the legal team, the attorneys that are actually ultimately the group that hire us on their client's behalf. We have a level set up front that we're going to look at this, as I mentioned earlier, in an impartial, unbiased view. And so far, in my experience as being part of the expert witness cases that we've worked on in the past, rarely is one party 100% at fault. And we set that tone up front. There is quite a bit of fault on the client side, on the plaintiff side, when a lack of understanding of what this kind of project is going to happen, lack of oversight of the SI. So we look at this again from an impartial perspective, but typically we see the burden is on the vendor side. They're the experts. That's why they were hired. The contract is being paid by the client. So it's really the burden of success falls on the technology team that's hired. Again, that's the expertise that the client is looking for. Again, there's a number of fingers to point on the client, on the plaintiff side as well. But typically what we see is the rigor and the approach of how the implementation is progressing is really on the vendor side to get it right and declare any kind of issues or risks along the way so that it never gets to litigation in the first place.
Right. Yeah. That's a good overview. And, I remember my first expert witness case. I didn't even know what an expert witness was. I kind of knew, I've watched TV and have seen the concept of expert witness, but I didn't really know what expert witness meant in the context of our industry. And I remember it was the waste management versus SAP case. This was probably 15 or 17 years ago when that lawsuit happened. And that was the first time I had ever done expert witness work. It was about 15 years ago when those attorneys contacted me for that case. And so for me, that was a really memorable one because I got to learn what an expert witness was while I was being an expert witness on one of the most publicized failures in recent memory. But from your perspective, without mentioning names necessarily, can you describe the biggest or the most complex or the most memorable expert witness case that you've been involved with so far?
Yeah, and appreciate that question. It's interesting because I look through all the cases that we've worked on in the past, regardless of industry, whether it's retail, manufacturing, distribution. The challenges come up again, not speaking names, but of course, many of the software platforms were the large ones, SAP, Oracle, and the like. What really becomes a challenge and issue around the complexity is those clients that have spent 20, 30 years developing proprietary software. They haven't really gone out to the market and looked at off-the-shelf systems, especially the scale of an ERP or other enterprise systems. And they get into the process of, I want the new system that is multi-tenant in the cloud. Functionality is kind of homogeneous at some level. And I want the system to do exactly what we did internally from a developed system for 30 years, day one, and I don't want any customization. And so the complexity of some of these cases, we had a retailer, they manufacture but also distribute other products where they would look at outgoing shipments and we're talking thousands of shipments a day out of their manufacturing and distribution center. And they would reset who gets that product on a daily basis. So the complexity of how to release product back into inventory, allocate that inventory to the highest priority customers that day, and then assign the product that may have been part of a previous order the day before, gets reassigned to a new order because that customer is more important to them. And to do that at the scale that multi-billion-dollar company, most out of the box, off the shelf systems can't handle that kind of processing. So we can talk about some of the challenges of why that project even got to that state. But really the complexity comes from those individuals, those clients that have developed their own software. So it's very unique to them, or they have never really done something like this before. And so the complexity isn't just the technology, but the project itself. And in one of the cases, and I'm sure we'll get into it today, one of the challenges, and we see this happening often with the client side, the most often the plaintiff client, is the fact that they turn the keys of the implementation over to the system integrator. They don't know this. They don't understand what's going on. Here, make us happy. And that generally starts the process of disconnect around the phases of the project. And that's usually when there's issues of delay in the project, overruns on budget that come around. But really, it's the sophistication of the homegrown systems, regardless of the industry, that really trips up a lot of outside system integrators and software vendors from our perspective.
Yeah, that complexity is a great point. Every business has their complexities, but there's some obviously that have more complexities than others. And it's always interesting when we're in these cases, or when we analyze these cases. One thing that you alluded to is you get to do that forensic analysis where you get to see every single artifact and every single email, every single piece of documented proof that this implementation ever happened. We get to see that. So every email that is exchanged, all the sales presentations, the contracts, the status reports from the project, the steering committee presentations.
Right.
We look at all that stuff, and you typically see, the discussions that lead up to that discussion around complexity and that sort of thing. And one of the things that's really interesting in these cases, a lot of times software vendors will say, well, you're too complicated. Just use the software the way we built it, and that'll make things less complex. But it's not always that easy, as we saw with that case you just mentioned, the manufacturing distribution company. You can't just change that overnight, a way that a company's been doing business for decades or sometimes longer. So that's super interesting.
Well, an interesting point to call out is we get called in because the quote unquote implementation has failed. But we almost always start our assessment projects, as obviously our legal expert witness cases as well, is how the project got started during the selection phase. Typically, we see that it's really the ambiguity, the soft approach during the sales cycle and the selection process that really starts this project off on the wrong foot. The challenges of seeing this wonderful stuff at a conference, having more demos of fixed functionality, and then just doing a lot of head nods and agreement that, oh yeah, your unique processes, we can handle that. Don't worry about that. And then they go off and secure a 5-7 year contract on licenses, a 5-year implementation, and then get into very loose requirements. And then the implementation, again, as I mentioned, starts off on a very poor setting. So rarely is the implementation itself the failure. It usually is indicative of how the sales cycle and the selection worked in the first place. And to that point, when we get hired, Third Stage gets hired to do system selections, we rarely start looking at, these are the systems we would recommend right up front, right? It's more about what is unique to you. A lot of these, again, multi-tenant SaaS ERP enterprise solutions are meant to be used out of the box. And many of the functional areas of these ERPs are just that. They're blocking and tackling, financial, accounting, procurement. Those tend to be competitive advantage for our clients, right? So we want to really focus on, during the selection phase, what's unique about you. what are those processes of that functionality that you will not use out of the box? And that's usually when we start figuring out what is that smaller pool of systems that could be worked in that environment. Rarely is, again, I mentioned the blocking and tackling, right? How do you receive shipments? Typically is not a competitive advantage for our clients. It's more about, as I mentioned, that other legal case, how product is assigned to an order and shipped out, how they deal with customers from a CRM configuration effort. Those are ones that are the tricky ones. Everything else that a lot of the ERP platforms support are just that, just basic platform foundational functional areas that aren't a competitive advantage. So those areas tend not to be tripped up in a implementation that goes south.
Right. Right. Yeah. Great points. And I want to turn to the audience too, just to acknowledge where people are joining from today. Deb is joining from Toronto today. Maurice from Netherlands. Thank you for being here, Maurice. Carmen from Sydney, Australia. Thank you for being here. Alcinda from Johannesburg, South Africa. Fuad from Brunei. We had a client in Brunei not too long ago, so good to have you here, Fuad. And then Jay's from Toronto. So we've got a large Canadian contingency here today, among other countries. So thank you all for being here. And again, if you have any questions for Scott and I as we're going through the conversation, please drop those in the chat. We're watching the stream from all the different platforms here today, and I'll keep asking my questions, and then eventually we'll get to the audience questions here as they start to roll in. And you started to allude to this a little bit, Scott. You started talking about complexities and of a client's business, and you talked about outsourcing to a system integrator and how that can lead to challenges. And you started to allude to this a little bit, but if we were just to back up for a second and say, what are regardless of whose fault it is in these cases, when we're analyzing the cases and we're testifying in court and doing our analysis there, what are some of the root causes? Like if you were to summarize, the patterns that are pretty common in these different expert witness cases and or situations where we go into a client and help them get a project back on track because it's failed, and maybe it's not a lawsuit yet, but they'll hire us to come in and basically recover the project. In both sets of clients that you've been involved with, what would you say are sort of the major patterns or themes that contribute to the failure in general?
And we may talk about this later, but we don't typically see the technology itself as a key point of friction. Most of the systems that get selected can handle 99% of everything that a company wants it to do, with a few tweaks here and there. And having taught undergraduate and graduate classes in project management, it's interesting that some of these complex multi-million-dollar projects come down to the fundamentals of how a project should be run. Almost every client wants to get the system live as fast as possible. They skip the most important point or phase of the project. Is the planning, and making sure that what is the definition of success, right? What are we actually expected to achieve at the end of this project? Making sure that you have a feasible pace of the project. Many times they want to replace legacy systems plus process changes plus new functionality they don't have. And even at the very beginning, that's a 3+ year project. Well, I don't know what's going to happen next week, but I promise it's going to be different than what I'm thinking. But if you plan out a 3-year project, expect that it's going to take a lot of different left turns. And so the longer the project, the less likely you're going to stay on track. If you go into it with too much expectation, you put too much on the plate of the system integrator and your own team, likely to be a failure. But it's interesting that even in the world of agile methodology, and a lot of software development firms want to use that concept, it doesn't mean there shouldn't still be rigor. And one thing that we find, even when clients hire us to help from a PMO standpoint on an active project, very little documentation and very little updating of that documentation is our first big sign that something is wrong. Because if we get onboarded on a new project, in fact, we have an active project right now. It's a global multi-year, multi-million-dollar project. And we come in, the easiest thing for us to assess is give us all your documentation of where you are today. And if the answer is, well, we don't have too much documentation, or here's a document, we created it 2 years ago, we just haven't updated it yet, is our first big indication that something's off already. Because there's no way that the client team, the system integrator really understands where you are in the project and what, again, that end state is. I think that clients that don't have the expertise in this area still tend to want to engage with the system integrator directly. And you're at a disadvantage at that point if you don't really know how to implement an enterprise system, and yet you're hiring somebody that is the software vendor sometimes themselves to run it entirely. It tends to create problems of accountability. And we talk about this a lot in project management, of traceability of the project. So what was the original intent of the project? What was identified as requirements and approved by all parties at the beginning of the project? How does it move through configuration, testing, and deployment with test scripts and test scenarios and user stories? There isn't many times a traceability from the beginning and end that's easy for somebody like us, if we're hired midstream, to understand where we are. And so when we get hired as a legal expert, the first thing we ask the legal team is give us access to all, as you mentioned, videos, demos, documents, whatever it is. And if we get started in that, and it's very hard to start piecing things together, even at the very beginning, the hair on the back of our neck starts raising because it's just difficult for anyone in a big enterprise system to be able to understand where things are in flight if things aren't properly documented around the way. And I speak about this a lot to our clients, is that rarely is one methodology, waterfall or agile, ideal for a enterprise system. It's usually a hybrid form. But the problem is a lot of technology firms that implement systems use this concept of agile to get away from being required to document a lot of stuff. And that's a problem.
Yeah. I think in the spirit of agile, of moving fast and not slowing things down, not having a lot of red tape on your project, in that intent, a lot of times what happens is you end up with a lack of direction, and the project ends up going off the rails because you don't have clarity and documentation and alignment on what exactly it is we're trying to build.
Right.
What's always interesting is when attorneys first contact us, a lot of times what they say is, hey, we want to hire an expert like Third Stage to come in and really analyze the code. A lot of times that's what the lawyers will say, hey, we want to analyze the code and really get in and show how it was a basically poor workmanship in the way that the software was built and deployed. And usually what happens is you start asking why. Like, why do you want to look at the code? Because usually, that's not going to be a winning argument. Typically in cases like these, it's going to be, to your point, all the other stuff. It's going to be the way the project was managed, the way you aligned the business processes or not with the software, and vice versa. And usually the software itself, quote unquote, works, but it doesn't work for the business. And that's usually where the rub is, or where the challenge is.
We do occasionally get a legal expert, or expert witness case where the software vendor oversold what the platform can do at day one. Vaporware, it's on their roadmap kind of thing. And that's usually the extent that the software itself doesn't match the requirements it has, is that there's functionality that was oversold and it never became part of the project because it took the software vendor too long to develop that along the way. But rarely, to your point, it's the nitty gritty. Let's look at the code. Let's look to see how they've logged what they're doing in the comments in a code stream. Rarely do we need to get to that level, because it's rarely that's the reason a system failed or an implementation failed.
Right. Yeah, great point. And here's a few questions that are circling around a common theme here from the audience. So I'm gonna pull up a couple of them and just try to summarize it here. But this is Fuad on LinkedIn says, what is the ideal number of people needed to operate per module? And then I'm gonna sort of build on this one by one here. And then Darian asks, how many people does the company that's doing the project need to put on their project team? And then this is kind of a funny response / rhetorical question from Paul on LinkedIn, who's responding to Darian's question, saying, how long is a piece of string? So I get what Paul's saying. It's hard to answer the question with clarity, but I'll ask it anyway. Or maybe I'll sort of frame it a little bit differently here. Instead of giving us a number of like, what's the magic number of people you need on a project to ensure you don't fail? That's not a realistic question, just because it depends on so many different variables:
Yeah.
scope, size of company, complexity, is it full-time or part-time, all that stuff. So we won't necessarily get into that exact number, but maybe to frame it a little bit differently, when you're looking at these cases, when we're analyzing these failures, how often or how often is it related to the fact that the client themselves didn't have enough people supporting the project, or there's some sort of resourcing issue or input issue on the client side? How often does that happen?
Sometimes we would like to see clients in an active project have more full-time bodies on a project than a higher count, but less percentage associated with the project. So even believe it or not, I think even a very large enterprise system doesn't require as many people as you think. Per work stream area, 3 to 5 is sufficient in many cases. But it's the amount of time the company is able to give those resources to the project. Because one of the things, and this is one of those areas where we see the client to blame, meaning the plaintiff or the organization funding the implementation, is that we require that the client, whether it's agile, waterfall, or some hybrid, actively agree and accept work product as it goes through the organization. So the need for approvals is quite high in an enterprise system. But when a lot of folks that are on the client side don't have the time to devote to the project, those approvals, those decision points get dragged out. And then you'll hear potentially the CIO or CFO tell the software implementer, stop dragging your feet, move forward. So then they get into a habit of saying, hey, I'm going to send over this piece of a document or this decision point for you. If I don't hear from you in a week or two, we're going to assume it's approved and we're going to move forward. That's a problem on all kinds of fronts. But many times the SI will do that because they're being forced to move forward and the client isn't providing the approvals on a timely basis. But the severity of those decisions still requires at some point for the project to pause until the client approves a major scope change or a different direction the project needs to take. So resources, it's more about full-time than total FTE count. And it's also being engrossed in the decision-making along the way. Do not defer to any software vendor or vendor in its basic form to make decisions on behalf of the client. If you start doing that, and then you realize the SI has gone down a wrong path, it's too late to say, I'm going to stop this project and sue you because you shouldn't have done that. Because we will ultimately find emails saying, hey, do what you think is best. And that's a big problem.
That's a great point. You're sort of giving up, not your leverage necessarily, although you are giving up leverage in the future. If it gets to a lawsuit phase, you've sort of you've relegated blame, I guess, or you've taken on more blame at that point because you didn't, you didn't document what you needed or wanted. I'm going to get to a follow-up here question in just a second. But first I want to address this question from Ozzy on YouTube. Says, is this actually live? And I replied in the chat, yes, it is live. And if you'd like me to prove it further, if you'd like further evidence that this is live, ask another question and we'll answer it live here. How about that? Just to prove that we're live here today.
There you go.
But here's the real question I want to get to here. This is from Ganesh on LinkedIn. This is a super interesting question. I don't know that I've ever addressed this. I'm curious to see what you think, Scott. Ganesh says, traceability sounds good, but won't it lead to micromanaging and eventually a lack of trust? I've never heard of that question, but it's a great one. I really like that question. I'm curious to see what your thoughts are. How do you balance that, or how do you find that right balance?
Actually, I think it's the counter to that. The effort up front in the planning phase, and by the way, of all the most important phase of the project, kickoff, planning, config, design, test, train, deploy, planning is the most important aspect and most important phase of any project. Go slow to go fast. And in fact, we're doing a level set with a client right now, outside of an expert witness case, where we're kind of going backwards to clarify again, what's that definition of success? What are those ingredients that are going to be necessary to be in place for the system when it goes live to be successful? And so understanding that full scope of requirements to the level of I can hand a book of requirements to a system integrator and they should have very few questions, right? Without that beginning phase or beginning starting point of traceability, you are going to require micromanaging along the way because there's not very little documentation at the beginning and very little documentation along the way. If I know what the scope is once we leave the planning phase, I have a pretty strong confidence the bulk of that, if not all of it, should be there when we're doing testing and training, right? So I actually think the more you document the fine points, the less you have to micromanage.
Yeah, it's a great point. And the more you ensure that you're all on the same page and you all have clarity of what it is you're trying to accomplish with the project, all that good stuff.
You brought up a question earlier, or somebody did, about resources. Let me address that as well. We see this frequently, not all the time, but frequently during an expert witness case where the defendant, the software vendor, the software system integrator will say, well, you had a number of executives leave the company, are sponsors of the project, and so that caused the problem, or you had a lot of turnover on your project staff. Our feedback to that is if you have proper documentation along the way, it should be very easy to onboard somebody, what the original scope was, the project charter, what the requirements are, and where you are in the phases of the project. Using turnover as an excuse of, well, we had to re-educate folks and that caused a lot of delay in the project doesn't fly well, because I think the documentation and proving and tracking where you are on the project would cover any kind of issues that resource changes would happen. And quite honestly, on the flip side, we hear that quite often with the system integrator is we have a problem with the project because the SI had a lot of turnover of staff.
Yeah.
Again, with proper documentation, the onboarding process should be very straightforward for them to get up to speed very fast. Without documentation, it's learning over the shadow and the shoulder of other individuals on the project. And that's the problem for a lot of clients.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and along these same lines, I was actually hoping this person was watching this live. This is from Marcus Harris, who is a attorney, by the way, and he, just as a side note, we've done work for him, and we've been a client of his in the past for cases he's been involved with. And he's a lawyer that specializes in contract-related issues as well as lawsuits like this. So if you're in the unfortunate situation of needing an attorney in a situation like this, he's a great guy to contact. But anyway, Marcus is watching in on YouTube, it looks like, and he asked the question, what documents are the most important to mitigating the risk of failure? For example, statements of work, project plans, et cetera. So is there a certain type of documentation that you think is the most important to have to sort of mitigate that risk?
Well, the statement of works are important just because that's a very heavy, influential, legal contract document, right? It tells about scope and assumptions, constraints, but most ERP or enterprise implementations take years, and there's quite a few change orders that are likely to happen. So that's more of a point in time. It's really getting into the design documents, the configuration documents, and the true set of requirements, whether that's in a tool like Jira or it's simply in an Excel spreadsheet or other tracking items. The design documents and the requirements are by far the biggest influences of what is going to be done on the project. But on top of that, most enterprise systems have change orders. It could be a schedule change, a scope, budget, or the like. When those changes take place, there are certain documents like design documents, like the requirements, that need to be refreshed frequently to accept that. I refer a lot of this to building a custom house or an office building, is that the original blueprints are not what the as-builts are at the end of it. And when you don't have updates that take place with even a few number of documents, like I mentioned, becomes a problem at the end, because if I was the CIO or COO or president, I want to know what that SOWs looked like, what the change orders were, what those design docs and requirements were, should reflect what I'm getting at the end. But most people create project plans Obviously, SOWs are a point in time. Things happen along the project, whether it's a change order or not, and nothing gets updated to reflect that. No meeting notes, no status reports, things like that. So at the end of the project, it's very hard to figure out how we got here. But it's really about I would say the architectural plans of a project are probably the most important, but they have to be in layman terms. The staff that the client is going to put on the project rarely are IT experts, and certainly are not in that system because they wouldn't have hired an SI to do it in the first place. So it needs to be in very layman terms what is to be expected during the config and development phase.
Right. That's great. Great points. I agree with you on that too. That those are some of the key documents you need. And we're getting so many good questions from the audience here. It's actually hard to pick the best ones to focus on here. But here's one that I think you'll like, Scott, because you and I are both Big 4/Big 5 consulting guys previously in our lives. This is from Ozzy on YouTube. Ozzy asks, do you think Big 4 consulting is losing impact in the ERP consulting market? I feel like boutique firms have more selling value in the modern world of specialized tech offerings. I say this as a Big 4 guy. So curious, what are your thoughts? And maybe to add to that a little bit, is the size, are the Big 4 more likely to get themselves into legal issues or lawsuits related to these projects?
Well, that's two-pronged question there. I would agree with Ozzy's question that because of the selling point of more boutique firms that have great resources in them, like us, offer a better value, price to value than a lot of these consulting firms, these large Big 4. But I would say that those firms will almost always get the very large, publicly facing company projects because the board, the C-suite, almost require a firm of that scale and authority to win those projects. Most of those boutique firms, I think, still have a role in those large projects because we typically come in, firms like Third Stage, come in as kind of the PMO, change control, change management experts. And that really works out well for the client because they get the scale and depth of a Big 4, but then also the uniqueness that we provide many times because of these expert witness cases where we can guide the project better than if it was just a client and a Big 4. But one thing that we call out often during our sales cycle to a large client going through a big ERP is that you like the name of a Big 4, but quite honestly, the staff that gets assigned to your project will change frequently throughout the duration of the project. And in many times, they go out to the street and hire contractors to come under the umbrella of the Big 4 and work on those projects. And again, one of the clients that we have today, that's the case. We asked for a roster of all the folks on the SI, and half of them have outside email addresses. So be leery about hiring a Big 4 just to get the name, because most of the staff may be folks that will work for us one day. So it's be careful that you're never going to get the A players across the board on many of these projects if you hire a Big 4. And so we see that often in our expert witness cases where they put full faith in a Big 4 implementer, but then they find out that staff turnover is so extraordinary, they don't even know who's on the project at any given time. That knowledge transfer tends to wane quite a bit. So be leery of that, but they will always be in the play for these big global public companies. That's not something that's going to go away, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. Agree. I totally agree with that. And what's interesting as you were talking, and I was thinking of a follow-up question here that I'm going to ask in a moment, but I'm going to ask you a question here in a second about software vendors too. Is there a correlation between named software vendor and failure rates? But as you were answering that question, I was thinking about this question, asking you here in a second. I was thinking about how, this is really interesting for the audience that might find this interesting, is when you're an expert witness, whatever side you're on, whether you're the plaintiff or the defendant, the attorneys from the opposing side do anything they can to try to discredit you. And one of the things they do, which I actually kind of enjoy doing from an expert witness perspective, is they'll go read like every blog I've published, or they'll watch this video. For example, this video will get reviewed by an attorney on the opposing side of a case at some point in the future. I don't know when and where, but some attorney is going to watch this. And if when they watch this, hello, good to see you. My name's Eric. I'm on the other side. But the reason they do that is they'll watch this video, for example, they'll watch this interview with you and I, And they'll say, wait, hold on a second, Scott. You remember this video from 3 years ago when you said that Big Four consulting firms are, you said they are more likely to fail. And of course, that's not what you said, but they'll try to make you try to twist your words because you just said that they hire people off the streets. I'm paraphrasing what you just said. And so what is interesting about that is that this, they go and they try to discredit any way they can to say that basically the side you're on, you've said something that actually supports the other side, and they try to discredit you in that way. So having said that, I'm just sharing that more of as an anecdotal or more of a general FYI for the audience. But when we look at software vendors, then and you look at SAP and Oracle and Microsoft, a lot of the expert witness cases we've been involved with have involved SAP. I'd say, SAP has probably been the most common failure that we've seen in terms of expert witness work. And then Oracle and Microsoft are pretty common as well. And then, of course, we've done expert witness work for other or related to other software vendors as well. But do you see any sort of correlation with the name of the software vendor or, the technology being deployed? Do you see more common failures in one part of the market versus not?
Well, I'll say that humans are humans, right? There's personality conflicts, there's challenges with cultural backgrounds, experience, and just work-life balance. And so even if you and I were the ideal consultants for one client, we may not be for the other. And so in many cases, these software vendors, the ones that actually own the software, tend not to be great implementers because that's not their job. They're here to develop software, deploy software, update software. They rarely are the ones that are great in implementing their software because they tend to have fewer staff than necessary. And we get right back into swapping out resources on a project. But I would say that software platforms that have very structured internal processes of how data flows from one module to the other, the software vendors themselves, SAP as an example, tend to be very rigid in how they implement it as well. And so if you go to a third-party system integrator, they may tend to be more flexible in their thinking, whereas a lot of the software vendors like SAP, Oracle, and the bunch, even Salesforce to some extent, may be very rigid in how they go about engaging with the client and implementing in a live environment. And so much like the conversation we had with the Big Four versus boutique firms, some are much more agile in how they engage with the client, understand the scope, and conform and config going forward. I'll say something as well is that, and hopefully this doesn't come up on a future expert witness, very few ERP platforms can do 100% of everything a client wants to do. And so we talk about this a lot at Third Stage around fringe application, point solutions, best of breed, whatever you want to label, you want to call them, is that some of the big software vendors want to put all that functionality in their platform and potentially may require functionality changes that falls under the banner of customization. And so more boutique firms, third-party integrators may tend to look at other applications that fit those requirements better. And so it's a little bit of that rigidness that we see a lot when the SI is the software vendor themselves in not looking at other solutions to meet a client's needs. So either don't do that in the future because our system doesn't do it, or they'll go off on a customization trail that will get them in a world of trouble when it doesn't work in the larger ecosystem of a client's technology stack.
Right. Yeah, makes total sense. And you're right, that response will get quoted at some point in the future. An attorney's going to say, Scott, you just said that the vendor's fault, and that is not what you said, but they'll try.
It was a Tuesday. It's a Tuesday.
Right, exactly. Yeah, on Wednesday, it's a different story.
It's a different story.
Right. So this is from Fuad on LinkedIn. Fuad says, who needs to approve the change orders, and how important, maybe just to back up even more, how important are change orders during these sorts of cases?
Yeah, my preference for enterprise system implementations is to do as small of a phase and scope as possible, right? Do it often. Do it. Don't try and put everything in the kitchen sink in the first phase of a project, but plan out and let the client base know that you are already planning phase 2, phase 3. It's not getting thrown on a parking lot, and we're not going to talk about it again. But change orders will almost always happen, as I mentioned earlier, on large, longer spanning projects. Tends to be scope changes, because as you go through the configuration and design phase, you start realizing things that you didn't know about, that you want the system to do differently than during the very beginning of the initial requirements gathering. But one of the things, going back to the planning phase, is, in my opinion, the most important phase, is we talk about escalation, status reporting, issues and risks, and how the governance model works on these projects. We'll answer that question for him on who signs a change order. Tends to be the scale and scope of it. So if it's something that will impact a single work stream that isn't material, those tend not to require a change order, because there would have been some preconceived scaling that anything over $10,000 may require a change order. In some organization, it might be anything over 50 or 100,000 requires a change order. So it is different based upon the project. But once we get to a formal change order that impacts scope and certainly has a budget impact, usually goes back to potentially whoever signed the SOW, whether it's the CIO, CFO, president. If it requires a change order based upon that project governance, it tends to need somebody senior, because part of the process of them signing is to educate them on what this is about. If it gets signed at a lower level, it tends to get ignored by the senior leadership, because it never rises to their understanding. And then when they get a change order for $1 million, they want to know, how did we get here? And they were ignorant to the fact of how we got there. So at some point, from a governance structure, having them be part of a steering committee escalation path that is also includes change orders will help educate the leadership, because you never want them to be out of the loop of where the project is running. And many times they are. They have no idea, because they've trusted everyone to do their job. But the people that are doing their job don't know their authority and will make decisions without getting the leadership approval.
Yeah. And oftentimes, one way to view change orders is to view change orders as a potential symptom of something deeper. Usually there's a root cause behind why are we doing change orders. I mean, you think about the common reasons why. It's not as simple as saying, well, it's because we had to change the way the software was, or there's an assumption that changed. Those are real things. But usually if you dig even deeper, you find that one of two things is going on, or both. One is unrealistic expectations. We never had realistic expectations or realistic cost or realistic level of effort. So therefore, we need a change order now to realign expectations with reality. And the other potential root cause oftentimes of change orders is that the organization itself is resisting change. And to your point, if you allow lower level people in the organization to do change orders, a lot of times they're going to say, well, I don't like the way the software works because it doesn't look like my old system. So I want to change this software to look like my old system. Let's do a change order. And so you have to really, I totally agree with your point about project governance and executive visibility into change orders, because oftentimes if they are involved, first of all, a lot of times change orders won't happen as much just because people know that the executive needs to approve it. So that's going to remove a certain number of them just because people don't want to, they know they're going to be told no, or they just don't want to raise it to that level. But in other cases, when there is a change order that survives that fear, the executives can look at that and say, well, what's going on here? To your point, why are we doing this? Why, do we have a realistic plan? Are we just resisting change? Is there a better way to do this other than doing a change order? So I think there's a lot of good that comes from executives reviewing.
And to follow up with that on some of our expert witness cases, when we get called in to a case like this, or a situation where there's frequent change orders, and often the change order scope of budget is exceedingly high. Let's say it's a $5 million implementation, and every change order we're seeing is $1 million. That should raise all kinds of concerns in a live project. But when we look back, when the client signs those excessive change orders, it pretty much in many cases gives the approval that the project is okay and that the change orders are okay. So if you truly have a problem of how the project is progressing, but you're signing the change orders. As I mentioned, one party is rarely 100% at blame. That's a concern from us from a client plaintiff perspective, is they're doing a horrible job. It used to be 2 years and now it's 5 years and we still don't have a working system. If we come in as an expert witness and see that you signed a $1 million change order every year, that means you're giving credence that change order is valid and that the project needs to change according to that change order. So be careful as a client signing change orders, because you are giving approvals that you're progressing the way it should be progressing. And that rarely is the case if you have too many change orders.
Yeah. Totally agree with you there. Here's a really interesting question from Ozzy. And to be fair, this is probably a question that would be better for Marcus Harris, who is in the audience here today, the attorney I was telling you guys about. But we'll see if we can take a stab at this question here, Scott. This is from Ozzy on YouTube. Ozzy says, "I'll stop asking questions, I swear. And please don't stop asking questions. These are really good questions." But Ozzy says, "At what point does the consulting firm stop iterating the delivery to fulfill the SOW and decide to just take on the lawsuit?" Or in other words, just get sued? Maybe help us explain, how does this, obviously lawsuits don't just happen overnight. It's not like one day an executive wakes up and says, "You know what, I think I'm going to sue the vendor." Usually it's weeks and months and sometimes years of things culminating and percolating and building to the point where there's a failure. And oftentimes what happens too is the end client stops paying the vendor. A lot of times that's an interesting dynamic too, is they say, "Hey, this thing's not going well. We're just going to stop paying the vendor." And so what ends up happening in those cases is vendor gets sued and then vendor countersues because client didn't pay their bills a lot of times. Yep. And that just sort of, in my opinion, that just sort of makes things messier and more confusing, because now you've got this economic thing, and that could be a reason why, vendor didn't fulfill their obligations or whatever. But in your opinion though, Scott, or maybe not even in your opinion, just as a matter of fact, when we see these cases, how does that typically unfold with the software vendor? Do they at some point say, "Hey, just go ahead and sue us, we're done"? Or how does that typically materialize?
Well, we are not attorneys.
Right.
And in our opinions that we write in our expert witness reports are from arm's reach of what we see as problems with project management alike. We tend to be told, and we don't like to add any kind of legal opinion at all. These people are in the fault because of this reason. We don't say those kind of things. Right. But if it gets to, so I don't want to sound like a broken record, but if you do the planning effort correctly, you'll know pretty soon whether there's a point in time where it's like, this is not going to work out. So it's either on the SI, software vendor side, that they overpromise software and all the requirements are no problem. But as they get into the project of how do I actually configure the system to do that, and the cadence and scale of the change order starts to increase, there should be a natural point where the entire project needs to pause, because there's obviously a disconnect between what you're able to deliver and what we want. On the flip side, from a software vendor standpoint, if you find the client along the way is becoming unreasonable in adding new requirements, saying, "Actually, that is in scope because that's what I meant in that requirement." If that frequency happens a lot, and when you're like, "Hey, this is truly out of scope, this is something we've never talked about," and they're like, "No, it is," very early on, you're going to see whether this is a partnership or not. And so they undersold the scale of the project just to get you started. I would like to believe that there's always a workable solution in a project, even if it's a point of, we're going to reduce the scale tremendously, or the scope tremendously, to get you something of value and then part ways amicably. But it's very difficult because a lot of human emotions get into these litigation situations where neither one wants to put their sword down. And it usually gets longer in the implementation than it should in many of our expert witness cases, because no one wants to show fault or blame. And it kind of is a situation where we talk about hiring a boutique firm, even if you have a big four, is typically if you have a third party involved in the implementation, Their job is to be able to be a referee and say, this is what I'm seeing, this is what I'm feeling. There's a problem. We need to pause before it gets to a litigation standpoint.
Right.
If it's just the client and a software implementer, that tends to extend the problem too long and it becomes a legal situation. But when's the exact moment that it feels like it's going? That's usually a situation awareness perspective that you just have to see that this is not a partnership like we thought.
Right. Right. Yeah, and Paul on LinkedIn has a great point that sort of adds to what you just said, Scott. Paul says nobody wants to sue anybody. It takes a lot and many are settled out of court with the
Yep.
help of Marcus. And Marcus, of course, is Marcus Harris, who is in one of the audiences, if not both, either YouTube or LinkedIn. But if you look up Marcus Harris, he's someone that can help you from a legal perspective. But I think Paul brings up a good point that first of all, people don't want to be in lawsuits. It's not like companies are, for the most part, they're not overzealous and excited about suing. It's usually like a last resort. But I think that's one thing. And secondly, one thing Paul alludes to that's really important to point out is most of these cases never get to court. So
Mm-hmm.
when I are hired to be prepared, we're ready to testify in court. But of the 50 or so cases that our team has been involved with, I'd say we've testified in maybe 3 or 4 of the 50. Either we've testified in court or we've testified in arbitration. 99% of the time it settles, out of court, because no one wants that publicity. It looks bad for the software vendors. It usually looks bad for the client as well. Their customers see that they had a failed ERP implementation. That does not look good for the end customer either. So I think both parties have an incentive to keep it out of court if they can. So I guess just to ask you more of an opinion-based thing here, Scott, which no matter how you answer this, some attorney someday is going to quote you on this and they'll use it against us, but I'll ask it anyway. But do you see the rate of failure increasing or decreasing or staying the same? What do you think is going to happen here with the future of ERP implementations and digital transformations?
I'd like to say that the amount of legal or expert witness cases that we may be called into will decline, because I think a lot of clients have more access to supporting resources, access to more information about how to control projects, what does entail before we go down this journey. So I'd like to believe that the amount of resources available to clients will allow them to stay out of trouble. But I can't necessarily say that without smiling and saying that human nature is human nature. We will tend to go down the shortest and easiest path. And that sheer capability of us to skirt the difficult conversations, the difficult work about prepping an organization before going through an implementation, I think we're going to see that they're probably going to be status quo, just because as people ebb and flow in the organization and the economy is changing, the external environment is changing quite rapidly, there's going to be the ability to shortcut the right methodology of a project. And that's just going to have a tendency of repeating history. And so I'd like to say that it would go down, but I think it's going to be probably status quo.
Yeah, I agree with you. And you mentioned something that's really important that we could actually spend a whole nother podcast on, and maybe we will spend a whole nother podcast interview on this someday. But the human behavior and the human flaws, that comes into play here, and it creates these organizational decisions that lead to the same failures over and over, regardless of how great technology is or how much technology advances. We as humans tend to make the same mistakes. And one of the biggest ones is we as humans, you look at a project and you look at all these different line items and the money you're spending. And for some reason, we as humans gravitate to the technology because I can see it. I've got my phone right here. It's physical. I can see the software, but I can't see the change management. I can't see the behavioral stuff. I can't see the operational efficiency or inefficiency. I can't see any of that, but I can see the technology. So I'm going to focus all my effort on deploying this technology, building it, testing it, all that stuff. And then we as humans just put the blinders on unintentionally in most cases, focus on the technology, and we don't think about all the other stuff that's more likely to make or break the project. So I think you're right. That right there is the gravity that I think is going to largely keep organizations in the status quo.
And I'll add, probably closing out on this, is that it's important also to note that go live is not the end of your transformation. And we focus so much on these multi-year, multi-million-dollar implementations But that's just the beginning, right? The organization needs to accept it and adopt it. That's actually what my dissertation was on. And it's proven that an organization that embraces the people side of transformation will have a higher likelihood of success of the use of technology and process changes. It just goes hand in hand. But the go live is just one phase of a transformation. You can't just simply blame it on the technology. There's the people element, as you mentioned, but also just how the organization embraces change as well. If you feel like the ERP implementation is a forced effort because a legacy system is going off support, that's probably a wrong attitude to have at the very beginning. It's about leveraging that ERP implementation for change itself.
Yeah. Great. And well said. And I was hoping you would say that ChatGPT and some of these other tools are going to make things easier for us and solve all the world's problems, but that is not what you're saying from what I'm interpreting here.
Nope.
So I guess just to close out the conversation, this has been a great conversation, but just to wrap things up and to summarize, what are some of the best things that organizations and project teams can do to keep their projects out of trouble and also out of court?
I would say understand what you're getting into at the beginning. Understanding why you're doing something and what the expectation is at the end. One of the agile mindset is, when are we done, right? When is this thing finished? And so making sure that you have a clear end goal at the very beginning is so important. If you're just saying, I want to replace the system that we have, it's rarely enough just to say that. What is the definition of success at the end?
Right. Yeah. Because at the end of the day, that's your organizational definition of success versus failure. Yep. And that's what's going to determine whether or not you end up in court in many cases. If you think it's a failure, you're more likely to end up in court. So great points. Well, thank you for being here today, Scott. This is a really interesting conversation. The audience had some awesome questions too. So thank you to the audience for that. Love to have you back on again. This is not your first time or your first rodeo on this podcast, but we'll definitely want to have you back on to unpack some of the stuff in more detail. Maybe even get into. I've been wanting to ask you questions about your dissertation or your is that what it's called? Your dissertation when you get your PhD. I've been meaning to ask you more about that. So maybe sometime we can do a podcast on
that.
Either way, thank you for being here to chat about this here today. Really appreciate it.
No worries. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. And you can find this interview is going to be repackaged, repurposed, and we're going to add some other stuff to it, and we'll make it part of our weekly Transformation Ground Control podcast. You can watch or listen to Transformation Ground Control every Wednesday. New episodes come out. You can go to transformationgroundcontrol.com to see all the different platforms you can listen or watch, or you can look for it on Apple, YouTube, Spotify, all the typical places that you listen to or watch podcasts on. So go to transformationgroundcontrol.com. Check us out every Wednesday. You'll see this interview show up on that podcast here in a couple of weeks. Thank everyone for your time. In the meantime, we'll be back here next Tuesday, same time, same place. We have different guests every week, so be sure to join us for these live discussions. The audience, are what makes these live discussions so much fun. So thank you for being here today. Have a great week, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you. See you, everyone.